Hi everybody, it's Lou. I'm back with another video. This video is a contest entry for Jason's channel, Otero 85. Congratulations Jason on the 100 subs. I think you're probably closer to like 150 now. But this is an entry for your contest. So Jason's contest is, he wanted us to pick starting with the 60s and onward, an artist for each decade, and talk a little bit about an album or an artist and why we felt they best represented that particular decade. Okay, so here we go. So the 60s, I'm thinking most people will probably pick the Beatles, but I decided to go with, and I love the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix is probably the most influential guitarist of all time. He always, in most top 10 lists of top guitarists of all time, comes in at number one. Even though he died back when he was 27, it's been almost 50 years since his death, and yet he's still so influential to so many musicians and people who just love music like myself. This particular record is the Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock. So Woodstock's another defining event of the 60s. This is a triple album set of Jimi's notorious performance at Woodstock. Triple gatefold. I'm going to try and show some of it here, but it's a little bit tricky. There you go. Again, part of the Jimi Hendrix reissue series. Wonderful. Any one of the Jimi live albums are fantastic to get. This one, of course, historic performance, and he's the artist that I feel best represents the 60s, in my opinion. 70s. So the 70s to me had some of the greatest music of all times, and there's so many bands coming out of the 70s. I think one great thing about the 70s is the frequency at which bands put out albums, and bands didn't really focus so much on like they did in the CD era of putting out albums with so many tracks that it ended up being a lot of filler tracks. Sure, there was a lot of double albums that came out in the 70s, but I really like the idea of an artist putting out an album every year or every couple of years, and including anywhere from 8 to 10 tracks. And one artist that was constantly releasing stuff in the 70s, this person had 10 albums in the 70s, an album I think for each year of the 70s, David Bowie. So David Bowie started in 1971 with his first album in the 70s, The Man Who Sold the World, and his last album was in 1979, the Lodger album. And he put out an album every single year except for 1978, which he put out a live album instead of a studio album. But you know, keep in mind he did put out two albums in 1977, Low and Lodger. But the album that I picked to represent him is, I think, the album that most people identify with Bowie when they think of, if you think of one album, and that's Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Even Kanye West, I think, knew that this album was a great album. As you can see, the K West sign back there. I'm sure some people have already pointed that out before. This is not my favorite Bowie album, but it's probably in the top 3, and certainly one I could have included on my perfect albums list. But is a fantastic, fantastic album that you know, never gets old. So again, David Bowie, he was the king of the 70s in my opinion. The 80s. The 80s was the time when I started to get into music. I had just turned 10, 11 years old. Just started listening to music, started taping stuff off the radio on cassettes. And the band that I was into in the 80s, which is my favorite band of all time, is The Police. I prefer The Police's earlier stuff, which is to say anything from Outlandos d'Amour, Regatta de Blancs, and Yada Mandata. The Police only put out 5 albums. This was their 5th and last album, but it was their most popular album. And The Police were probably the biggest band in the world around 1983, 1984. This album, of course, includes Every Breath You Take, which was a super popular song. I don't know, it's been, I think, 8 to 10 weeks at number 1 on the charts. I think most Police fans will tell you that Every Breath You Take is not their favorite Police song. That probably is more along the lines of Roxanne or Message in a Bottle, but certainly this album was the album that sent them into superstardom. The band, of course, broke up after this album, and then Sting went on his solo tour, and those albums did extremely well. And The Police did regroup in 1986 for the Amnesty International tour, and they headlined that tour. Even though U2 was probably a more popular band at that time, they felt that The Police was the right band to headline that tour. And I saw them on the reunion tour in 2007-2008, a tour that was extremely successful. It was wonderful to see them because I'd never seen The Police live back in their heyday. I'd only seen Sting live on a few solo tours. But to this date, they are my favorite band of all time, especially the material on the first 3 albums. This album is a fantastic album. Includes some big songs like King of Pain, Wrapped Around Your Finger, Synchronicity 2, some lesser known tracks like Tea in the Sahara, Walking in Your Footsteps. This is a great and highly recommended album that all of you should have. The 90s. Could have gone with several bands here. An honorable mention for the 90s is Oasis. I was heavily into Oasis in the early 90s, bought all their singles, and their first 2 albums, Definitely Maybe and What's the Story of Morning Glory, are certainly classics. I was also a big fan of Teenage Fan Club in the 90s, but I think the 90s is probably best represented by Nirvana. Of course, this is Nirvana's most well-known album, Nevermind, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Lithium, Come As You Are. Nirvana, I've also shown before their Unplugged album, and that was really an era where the Unplugged thing was really popular. And if you thought maybe there was a band that might have some difficulty translating their sound into the Unplugged format, Nirvana might be one of them, but certainly that Unplugged album and performance is one of the best. If you haven't picked up that album, you definitely need to get that, but get this one first. The 2000s. It gets more difficult as the eras go on, but I feel the band that best represents the 2000s for me are the White Stripes. Certainly this album, Elephant, and the song Seven Nation Army, the song Seven Nation Army went beyond this album into the sports world, where it's used a lot in soccer stadiums and events like that. I think the White Stripes also spawned a lot of groups that were influenced by their 2-member format, where there was sort of a singer-guitarist and a drummer. Other bands that come to mind, obviously the Black Keys come to mind, the Kills, Royal Blood. I think there's a lot of bands who saw what the White Stripes did and thought, you know what, we only need a couple of us to form a proper band and can be very successful in doing it. I don't know if any bands equaled the success of the White Stripes. Maybe you can argue the Black Keys are pretty close to that. But certainly this is a band that I would like to see reform, if just not to have these songs come back to life between Jack and Meg. And certainly Jack White's solo career he's done really well for himself as well. And he's been a big component, a big advocator for vinyl and record store days and that sort of thing. So the 2000s White Stripes. The 2010s, I'm going to go with my favorite current band, Tame Impala, and the album I decided to show is their most popular album called Lonerism. More popular because I think it's got their original sound, which was more guitar oriented. Currents may have sold more, which is their most recent album, and Rihanna's even done a cover of one of their songs. But this is the album that is my personal favorite of Tame Impala's. They kind of bring that neo-psych back. So, from Australia, there's a lot of bands from Australia that have done really well recently. Kevin Parker, who's really the main force behind Tame Impala, was actually in another band called Pond, which has a lot of members from Tame Impala. So bands, they traded membership between that band and Tame Impala's live band, and is really the band to me that stood out in the 2010s. So this is Tame Impala, Lonerism. All right, that's it. Thanks again to Jason, and congratulations again on the 100 subs and for putting this contest together. I welcome any comments, and subscribe to my channel and let me know what you think of this list of albums. Thanks a lot, guys.